Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today is really going to be different. We haven't had a show about art in the whole time that I've been doing this series, and it's because I don't know anything about art. And if I open my mouth, I'm going to say something stupid, which I will do today. But I do have somebody with me who can show me around. This is John Delmar, and he is one of my oldest friends. I'm not saying that he's old. I'm saying I've known him since, oh my gosh, it would have been 1967. 1967. He would know because he was a student of mine. I was teaching sociology at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, which at that point didn't have a campus yet. It was a brand new branch of the University of Massachusetts. So we were housed in the Salada Tea building in downtown Boston. And He was my student. And he was a damn good student. And at the time, he was actually doing a degree at Harvard and a degree at the University of Massachusetts at the same time. I never figured that one out. He became a lawyer, and he used to work in the law, prosecutions and things like that in New York City. But then I think he wanted a calmer life or something. So he became a real estate lawyer in New York and has been doing that in the Rockefeller Center ever since. Except that he is somebody who enjoys metropolitan life more than anybody else I know, because every day this guy is out on the street usually walking from one place to another to see either some new art exhibition or a lecture, somebody at a university or someplace, or to the Harvard Club for dinner, or to a concert or the ballet or someplace. He's very engaged with cultural life in Manhattan. So, and he goes to Florida sometimes, and he goes to Europe sometimes. He has a very sophisticated life. And when I first knew him, he had a practice of always doing a painting before he went to bed every night. He would create a piece of art. And I gather he still does it. Yep. And some of them are really good. I really thought, well, I should share this with the world. So I'm going to have John tell us about his art, but tell me about art in general, and show a bunch of pictures that he likes. And my assistant, Adam Wynn, is with me and is going to be actually showing these pictures whenever John asks for one. They've just been numbering them. Good morning, John Delmar. How are you?
Hi, Meta, and it's great to see you again. And it's true that we've been friends now for close to 55 years, which sounds impossible when I'm only 45 years old.
Oh, you know what? I didn't introduce one of the interesting things that made you especially intriguing to me. And that is that I used to listen to Jack Benny's radio show. And there was a character there named Senator Claghorn, whose voice I can still hear. I mean, I really would recognize that voice at a moment. And I wish I could even imitate it, but I can't.
I won't try and imitate my dad, but actually he did do a gig up with Jack Benny, but the regular program was called the Fred Allen Show.
Oh, maybe that's what I was thinking of. Yeah, Fred Allen too. Yeah.
Yeah. And which is a little off topic, but I'm glad you brought that in, because it was very interesting growing up in Manhattan, and people that are under 40 or even 50 would not know about the golden age of radio, before there was computers and before there was television. And so my dad's show, at the time I was born, was the #1 radio program in the United States, the Fred Allen Show. And so the character he played, as you said, was called Senator Claghorn, which is a character my father had created. And the purpose of it was to ridicule pompous Southern senators who were quite prolific and were quite common at the time because Southern Democrats dominated Congress at the time. And so there were a lot of political figures, Senator Bilbo and Senator Pepper and various others who were of the old Southern mentality where they literally were not giving up on the Confederacy. And a little later, there was some people may remember the name Strom Thurmond.
Oh, yeah.
And so Fred Allen, who was a very brilliant comedian, realized that the way to make fun of and to ridicule these political characters was to create a satire. And the irony there was that, so my father did play a very pompous and very ignorant sort of senator who wanted to go back to the pre-Confederacy. And he said, I say, I'm a senator here, and I saw a car waiting for me, and it was a Lincoln, and I refused to ride in it. So that was.
He always called people son.
Yeah, son, that's a joke, son. He would say, that's a joke, son. And the character was actually based on a real person. I'm sort of proud of the fact that my father was born very poor, and his mother had been an immigrant from England who came to the St. Louis Exposition in 1904, and from England with her sister. They had run away from a convent, and they were teenage girls, and they were put in a convent because they were considered too sexy as teenagers, and their parents wanted to keep them away from boys. So the parents were apparently pretty accurate about their daughters, because my grandmother came to America, and while a teenager managed to get pregnant pretty soon thereafter as a teenage girl. So my dad was born, apparently we're not sure whether his mother and father were married. There was a marriage certificate. So, but his mother was a 16-year-old girl who was raising him by herself. And so it was a very tough life. Again, this is as a historical note, a lot of people don't know or have heard about vaudeville, but vaudeville was basically theatrical people who would go from town to town, and every little town would have a theater. And so you probably had them in San Francisco. Later, they became movie theaters. And it was a very tough life because performers would go on a circuit, and there were various circuits, the Albee circuit, the Orpheum circuit, and the circuit would book you. So you would do one day in Buffalo and one day in Ithaca, and you would perform, you would do your act, and most theaters had 6 or 7 acts that they would have. They would have a dog act, and then they would have a comedian, and then they would have a singer, and so on. So this is what my dad started doing. His mother was doing the same thing, but they were not always on the same circuit. So even as a 7 and 8 and 9-year-old boy, he was on his own. And people,
and we should give his name, Kenny Delmar.
Kenny Delmar. And as I said, he's not known today, but he starred in a Hollywood movie. He starred on Broadway, and he was one of the main characters of the #1 radio show back in 1948. So, it
would have been earlier than 48.
Well, 48 was when his show was #1.
I see. Well, I remember him from days when, oh my goodness, at least 10, 12 years earlier, he was on those.
Well, he had been in radio again, and the most famous broadcast he did was the Orson Welles broadcast, which was the War of the Worlds broadcast.
What was his character?
What's that?
Who did he play in that?
Well, he actually, as in radio, people played various roles. So he played a character that was supposed to be Franklin Roosevelt, but it was actually called the Secretary of the Interior. And that radio broadcast is in fact, it's in a lot of sociology textbooks because of talking about mass hysteria and how mass media could influence people. So yeah, he played in that, he, among other characters, he played the military that first encounters the aliens. And then he later, they say, and all this takes place within half an hour, which nobody seems to realize would have
Oh,
been
really?
impossible.
I remember the day it happened because I remember the talk in my little town in Oklahoma. But I don't
Wow.
know that I listened. I don't think I listened to it at the time. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever heard it. But I remember the conversation. Everybody was talking about what had happened the night before. Yeah, it would have been in the 30s.
Yeah, it was around 1938. And that was a time, as you know, you're aware historically that Hitler was growing in strength in Europe. And so people were, and their only real link to the news was not television, not computers, but the radio was the only main source. We had daily newspapers, but for instant news, you would turn to the radio, and it was considered a very
Oh, yeah.
reliable source of information.
Mhm.
So, and I mentioned about my dad because it was a very creative household. My dad had very little formal education. And again, you were aware during the Depression was a time of great financial distress for a lot of people. So my dad had been born poor and then worked as an actor, which was a very difficult way to make a living. And was doing, he had a thing called the Stars of Tomorrow when he was just a little kid. And he was him and two young girls, and they were, let's say, 10, 11, 12 years old. And they would perform on stage. And what is kind of shocking and which almost seems impossible to me is that they were on their own, 12-year-old kids. So his mother was not necessarily around because he was sent off on these circuits. And then the other problem was, let's say he would be sent to Buffalo, and you'd take a long train to Buffalo, and then he would perform. And then he, you know, you'd think, well, then what happens? Do you go to a hotel? Well, most hotels are not going to want to rent a room to a 12-year-old kid, particularly actors, because they didn't trust that they would ever get paid. So then as a 12-year-old kid, he would sleep in the train station. And then after he performed, and then he would have to go to the next town, which would be Ithaca, let's say, or Syracuse, and then it might even go up to Toronto. And then it would come back down, and then he might play Chicago and so on. And so it was one night stands. And then the value of what your act would be was how important it was. And if you were a headline act, you got paid more. But you might, if you were like the fourth or fifth act on the bill, you might only get $5 for your performance, and you'd get paid cash. And sometimes if the act didn't go over well, they may not pay you at all. So my household was it was very creative and interesting because my dad, as I said, was an actor, comedian. My brother and myself, we, among other things, we had a house in Connecticut, and my dad would, we would bounce lines off each other and play different roles and did various politically incorrect stuff that wouldn't fly today, in that we often did dialects. And so my dad in particular did dialects. And on his radio show, the Fred Allen Show, it was all dialects of, there was a Jewish lady who had a very thick Yiddish accent. And then they had a fellow from Maine who had a very thick sort of New England, Maine accent. And then they had an Irishman who had a very thick Irish accent. So these days, of course, you know, it's considered ethnically incorrect to make fun of someone because of their national origin. And sort of this is getting off topique, but
it is a whole story in itself, you know. Sure. I mean, this whole your world of vaudeville is not something that I, you know anything about except for having read about it. But I want to let's go into your art business now.
Sure.
Because that's really what I had in mind when we thought about talking to you.
Right, exactly.
Show me some pictures and tell me some stories about art.
Well, I grew up in an artistic family in that my father actually painted as well as being an actor. And my mother was a ballerina who started at the Metropolitan Opera Ballet, but then later in life studied at the Art Students League and became a professional artist and sold many oil paintings and watercolors. And her twin sister also was a professional artist. So when I was growing up in Manhattan, my mother had an easel in the living room, and she was always painting. And we were on the corner with the Whitney Museum, literally 100 feet away from the townhouse I was literally brought when I was born and grew up. And then about a 10-minute walk away was the Metropolitan Museum. And in grammar school, I went to a school called PS6, a public school. And a block and a half away was the Metropolitan Museum. So for most 11 and 12-year-old kids, after school, you went off and played baseball, or you hung out with the kids and whatever. Went to the soda shop and hung out at the whatever. But I went to the Met Museum because school got out around 2:30, 3 o'clock, and then the Met closed at 5. So I had the 2 hours, and my mother was at art school at the time when I was in grammar school. She was still at the Art Students League. So she would finish art class at 5. So there was a 2-hour window before she would get home. And so I would go to the Met Museum, and I loved it because there was no admission charge, and you could just walk in, and they had period rooms. So if you had, like I did, a very vivid imagination, I could walk through these palatial rooms and sort of fantasize I was a knight in shining armor or a prince or whatever, because there were all these beautiful rooms to go through. And then there were the paintings themselves. And so I would spend many hours, not that my mother, twisted my arm to go. Sometimes she would actually go to the Met and she would copy paintings. But most of the time I went myself, and it was great fun for me. And then sometimes, like some parent of a little kid would say, well, we would go to the Met, and I would go, oh, look, there's a Rembrandt. Oh, look, there's the Raphael. And the mothers would always be shocked that this little 9-year-old kid would go through the Met. And I knew all the artists because I'd been there many, many times. But so my mother is a painter. Certainly that influenced me. Among other things, it influenced me that it was a very difficult way to make a living, because, as I said, my aunt, who was a professional artist, was one of the traditional starving artists who always had to work. She was doing silk screen work and other things to try and make a living, and ceramics. And my mother did beautiful floral watercolors. So they discouraged me from either becoming an actor or becoming an artist, which was probably a good idea, because I know a lot of starving artists and a lot of starving actors. But that didn't really kill the thirst that I had for painting and drawing. And so even as a little boy, in fact, I would sometimes get in trouble in grammar school because I would be in the back of the room and I would be doodling and drawing. I found some of the grammar school lessons exceedingly boring, because we had a grammar school book. We would spend all year reading this little book, which I read in the first day, and I thought, oh my God, we're gonna have to spend the rest of the year reading this book. So I'd be in the back doodling, and that got me in trouble. But anyway, let me show you what I thought I'd do is I'll show you some different works that I do. And as you point out, more for my own sake than thank goodness I don't have to make a living selling what I do, but I sell them because I post every day on Facebook. And I don't say like this is for sale or this is going to cost a certain amount. I just do this as a kind of therapy myself, because I find having a pen or a pencil or a paintbrush in my hand makes me feel much more relaxed. And I think neurologically, it even can trigger certain things. There's been studies done of the minds of artists while they're working, and it's a mental state that you get into an alpha state. It's a very relaxed kind of almost hypnotic state, and in that state, time and space become lost. And so I can start drawing at 11 at night, and then it'll be 3 in the morning, and I won't be hungry and I won't be sleepy. And then I'll suddenly be aware of time. I'll think, oh I better go to sleep. Mm-hmm. But so what I've done is giving you, I'm going to try and show you some artists that growing up. The other thing, in addition to the Met Museum, we lived on East 75th Street off Madison Avenue. And when I was growing up, that was really the gallery district area. Soho had not been invented. Tribeca had not been invented. And so art was pretty much limited to the very wealthy elites. And the galleries were all around 75th Street, where we lived, where the Whitney Museum was, and all the way up to in the 80s along Madison Avenue. And that's where I would often pop in the galleries. And I would personally see artists like, I remember seeing Alexander Calder. In another gallery, I saw Jasper Johns. All of these are incredibly, well-known, famous artists. So I was around these, and I was growing up where in our living room, my mother was painting every day, and I loved to draw and paint. Then I would often do it after school. So every once in a while, my mother and father would get into an argument about their parenting skills, and my mother would throw at my father and she'd say, "You never took Johnny to a ball game," and I had no interest in going to a ball game, and I still don't. And I can't tell you, I don't know who won the World Series last year or the 2 years before. Apparently they used to say when they would catch Nazi spies, they would say, "Who won the World Series?" And if you were an American, you were supposed to say the St. Louis Cardinals or the Yankees or whatever. And if I were ever caught and
they'd execute you.
and in grammar school, I did have to learn the roster of the Yankees, because if you didn't know that, you were obviously a communist spy. So I learned about Yogi Berra, and I learned about Whitey Ford and all those guys. But I never went to a ball game. And to me, it was like paradise to go to the Met Museum. It was a beautiful place. The other thing was that this was in the 1950s, and you could roll a bowling ball down the main corridors of the Met, and you would never hit anybody except a guard. Very few people went to the museums. So anyway, I'll show you some of the artists I've been influenced by, and maybe Adam here is going to be our great guide. So we're going to start with the number one. So this is Georgia O'Keeffe, and Georgia O'Keeffe in the last 15 or 20 years has become far more of a superstar. And this was done very early. This was done it's called Evening Star 6, and it's a watercolor on paper. It was done in 1917. And so this was quite original and quite revolutionary for the time of 1917. And Georgia O'Keeffe is a fascinating character. She's an extremely strong, independent woman. She was married to, which was useful if you're going to be an artist, a guy who owned one of the most influential galleries. But an extremely independent woman. So she was married to Alfred Stieglitz, who is also a world famous photographer. But this was before she met Stieglitz. And we tend to pigeonhole artists as well. So when you see Georgia O'Keeffe, most people think of flowers. And that was one particular subject that she got into and that people think of her. But she's a much more diverse and much more accomplished artist than just, people think of also of these pictures of flowers as being very female oriented. And some people see them as very Freudian. But anyway, with this wonderful picture, I just think it's great how I've always loved how an artist can do something with a great deal of simplicity. And so this to me looks like it says the evening star, but it looks to me like a sun over water. And so with a few brush strokes, she's given you this horizon and this beautiful yellow sun, and the colors are just so vibrant. And then you have a little bit of the blue mixed in here in the sky. And then this, but it's really only, it would take maybe a minute or two to paint this with just a few strokes. So that's something, as again, particularly Georgia O'Keeffe's early works. I admired her enough that we actually, my wife and I, who like to travel around, we actually visited New Mexico, and I insisted we go to Taos, New Mexico, and visit where there's an art colony there, and where Georgia O'Keeffe went to do a lot of her work. even though she was married to Alfred Stieglitz, they had a very independent marriage, and they used to go up to Lake George, and Georgia O'Keeffe was extremely bored going up to see Stieglitz, and the rest of his family was up there in Lake George. And so she went off by herself while they were married, and there was an art colony in Taos, and that's where she did a lot of her work. But this work was when she was first came to New York, and she was an aspiring artist, and Stieglitz saw her work and was immediately blown away. And there's a funny story that a friend of Georgia O'Keeffe's had taken some of her pictures and showed Stieglitz. And so without even asking Georgia O'Keeffe, he decided to give her a one-woman show. And so artists can appreciate getting a one-woman show at a gallery, and Stieglitz Gallery was one of the most influential because he was one of the first to show Picasso and Matisse and so on. So he immediately put up a show of Georgia O'Keeffe's work without asking her. And this is maybe an apocryphal story, but then friends of Georgia O'Keeffe said, "Oh, well, you have this wonderful show. Isn't that great? Congratulations." And she's like, "What? I didn't hear about this." And so she went to the gallery and she was furious. She was angry. She said, "What? How did you dare do this?" But in any case, mostly worked out because not only did she get her show and get, as a mentor, one of the most influential, Stieglitz, again, was a Jewish intellectual who also was very respected, and as I said, was an artist himself, one of the outstanding photographers of the 20th century. So also through that association, Georgia O'Keeffe herself got into a circle of intellectuals and artists, and most importantly, collectors. So in any case, I just find this picture, some people could say, oh, which I also, one of the great criticisms of art is my 10-year-old could do that. And that's probably the greatest compliment you can give somebody. You say, well, if your 10-year-old can do it, it shows you have this enormous creativity. And sometimes we lose the creativity that a 10-year-old has. And so artists like Picasso and others always said, you have to dig inside to find that creative aspect of your soul that isn't stifled. And if you can keep that creativity alive, then you're doing very well.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go to another.
Just a sec. Where do they keep this painting?
I believe there's a museum of Georgia O'Keeffe's work. When she died in New Mexico. There was a big fight over her work, but she had a number of pictures there. So I'm not positive where this is right now. I actually got these from a book, a Georgia O'Keeffe book that has a biography plus reproductions of her work. Some of them are in private collections. Something I recommend you, if you are in New Mexico, her house, I was a little disappointed. I expected it to be in the middle of the desert somewhere, and it's actually in a community with other people. She has next door neighbors that she could have thrown a rock and hit their houses. You can go to her house, and there's also a museum of her work there. She was enough of a real feisty woman. You can appreciate this, that in her late 80s and 90s, she took on, nobody knows quite what the relationship was, but he was a young, very handsome young man, maybe 40 or 50 years her junior. And he moved in, and, his name was Juan Hamilton, and you can look at pictures of him. He was, he was a potter also. And so he moved into her studio. And so, we don't know whether was this a romantic relationship. Most likely she left a lot of her estate to him. Mm. So hats off to her for her personal life, as well as her incredibly independent art that influenced a lot of people. Now, again, people could say, well, this is very childlike and, it's very simple. Again, very simple. It is. This is a watercolor, and it's a poster, and it's actually a poster I have in my study because I just love the color and the inventiveness. It's a Miro poster for Miro, and you can see there's what looks like maybe, again, just like that Georgia O'Keeffe had that sun that's a bright disc right in the center. And then if you look to the right, you'll see there's a face there, but the face is very simple. It's a little blue circle with a black dot in it is the eye, and then an L for the nose, and a very simple mouth. So you've got this sort of landscape of the sun, and then you have this face that's just right there on the right. And of course, Miro, it's a Miro poster, so he puts his name Miro. And Miro was, some people considered him an abstract artist, but Miro said, well, I never painted an abstract work. And he often simplified things to symbols of stars and suns and landscapes. I saw a Miro retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And among other things that I noticed that Miro was doing in the 1930s was he'd had some large canvases and was very actively painting on a large canvas surface. And you could see that the paint splashed onto the canvas. And so there's splashes of paint in various parts of his picture, which basically predicts the abstract expressionists. And so later in the 1940s, you had Jackson Pollock, who most people say invented action painting. Action painting meaning you literally take the paint and the action of the artist splashing the paint on the picture frame is the art. It's not put on by a brush. Sometimes a guy like Jackson Pollock would take a can of paint with a stick, and then he would dip the stick into the can of, and sometimes he would use commercial house paint. And again, this is something where it's been ridiculed a lot. Jackson Pollock was called Jack the Dripper as opposed to Jack the Ripper. And again, people say anybody can do that. You know, anybody can splash paint on a canvas. How do you compare that with Raphael and Rembrandt and Leonardo da Vinci? But the point is, you're not really, the purpose of art is not just to replicate something that already exists in life. And the nature of art itself changed a great deal once photography started to be introduced in the 1840s and 1850s in France by people like Daguerre and others. Suddenly artists realized that, you know, simply taking a flat plane and then replicating what was in front of you and spending days and weeks and months replicating every little hair and every little aspect of what was in front of you was not terribly creative, because now a camera could do the same thing with film. So you'll notice then that in the history of art, very soon after photography was introduced, you started to get Impressionism and artists who suddenly would say, well, you know, I'm only going to do my impression of what light is striking my eyes, or what I see as a vision. And then you get post-impressionists like Vincent van Gogh, or some people say Van Gogh, who doesn't look up at the sky and say, well, I'm just going to replicate these little dots just like they look, you know, in a photograph. But he gives you an expressionistic perspective. He gives you the sky as a much more exciting kind of vibrant surface that no longer just replicates what the eye can see, but what his soul sees, what he envisions. So again, with artists now, as we go into the 20th century, with artists like Miro and Picasso, they no longer are trying to replicate what, now certainly we have certain aspects of a face there, that you have an eye, a nose, and a mouth. But Miro isn't trying to do a portrait. That's not particularly anybody in particular. I do faces all the time, and sometimes people say, who's that supposed to be? And it's not supposed to be anybody. You know, the fact is, when you're creating something, if you're a creative artist, it's all in my mind. It's something, if I see a blank piece of paper, I can draw a face. I'm not looking at someone and saying that's supposed to be Meta Spencer. So anyway, this is again, the other things that I mentioned is bright, vibrant color. I don't always use vibrant color, but I admire it a great deal. And you can see here the contrast of that bright red, and then there's a yellow street coming down and little touches of blue. So the composition itself is very vibrant and very alive. Now this one, interestingly enough, and it's framed, so it actually the actual head, it keeps going right through the frame. You might be interested to know I did this when I was your student, and most people would say, "Well, you must have been on a trip. You must have been on LSD." And as maybe you can attest, I mean, I went through the '60s in Boston as a hippie with long hair and whatever, hanging out and going to rock concerts and whatever. And there was Boston in the '60s was everybody was stoned. I didn't do LSD. I didn't do marijuana. I didn't even drink. I've never yet had a drink of beer. I occasionally try and have a little sip of wine. So a lot of people think, you have to take LSD or you have to be stoned to have visions of things. But if you look at this picture, what it's meant is sort of the person's lost in thought. And what it's meant to envision is this face, this head, and how we have all these things rushing through our mind. It's not meant to be a real person, and it's not meant to be, a depiction of something that exists in real life.
But the whole painting is one face after another. You have to really start looking for faces that are embedded in this headdress or whatever.
Exactly. So there are actually at least like 5 or 6 different faces there. And some of them you really can't see unless you really do stare at it. But yeah, there's the main head, and then there's a head above it, and then there's another head above that. And yeah, there's at least 5 or 6 different heads. And what I was thinking about is sometimes when we think of things and we get a rush of images in our brain, and sometimes we'll think about a lost love, or we'll think about an incident that happened, or I love going to sleep and having dreams because I have wonderful, very interesting and complex dreams. So in this case, he's kind of dreaming, but he's also thinking. Paisley was big in the '60s too. So, in fact, the first apartment I had in New York, I went to a little shop and I bought all this Paisley fabric, and the Paisley was everywhere in my little studio apartment, which is an $80 a month apartment. And I had Paisley over the bed, and I had Paisley everywhere. So you can see that Paisley, which was actually from India. And so the people in India would carve these very intricate block prints and then block of wood. So yeah, you can see a little better there, all these faces. Not all of them are friendly. It's not, there's all different kinds of things going on. Again, this just comes from my mind. There were a couple of artists, I guess, like Peter Max and a few others who were known as psychedelic artists. But in any case, that was my while I was going to sociology classes and sitting in your class, I would go home and then at night I would do these little drawings, and I was doing them, frequently then, as I still do today.
Well, I never caught you doodling in my class, so you're lucky.
Oh no. Well, I don't know if you remember, but it was a great. I enjoyed it. One time we were talking about race and slavery and so forth. And I was, as usual, raising my hand and trying to, which would get you in trouble some places, because they would say, "You're trying to be teacher's pet. You're trying to, whatever." I just, one way to stay awake was be really involved in class. So I actually found, I was taking classes at Harvard at the same time. I was very interested in Black studies. And so there was a class where you just said to me, "Well, John, why don't you take over the class?" And I said, "Okay, you remember?"
No, I don't remember.
I mean, it wasn't meant to be nasty or sarcastic, like, "Wow, you take." So I did, and you said, "All right, well, why don't you tell us?" Because I was raising my hand all the time and speaking, and you said, "Well, what? Tell us about it." So you had me go in front of the class. Anyway. Despite a bit, and I was taking at that point sometimes 8 and 9 courses at once, because I was taking a full load at UMass and a full load at Harvard. And I still had time when I got home to doodle and do my artwork. So, but this is one of my very favorite artists, Henri Matisse, and it's called Reclining Nude. And it's not at all meant to be too racy, but Matisse was, as some may not know, had trained in France as a lawyer, and he was he went to Paris and he went to the law school in Paris, and he actually did the equivalent of passing the bar, and then he went back to his home, which was in more of a rural, smaller town outside of Paris, quite a ways outside of Paris, and he had gotten ill at one point, and his mother realized that he was bedridden, and she thought, well, what could she do to entertain him while he was bedridden? So she gave him a painting set, and so Matisse, at that point, who had no training in art and had been totally trained to be a lawyer, starts painting, and it changed his life. So he gave up the law and then went to Paris and studied art, and that also, not only did it change his life, but it pretty much changed the world. Because if we look at 20th century art, the two titans of 20th century art, before we reach abstract art, were Matisse and Picasso, who happened to be friends, or as some people would say, frenemies, because they were competing with each other. They both lived in the south of France. By the later part of their career, they both were quite wealthy and lived quite well. And they were constantly looking over their shoulders at what each was doing at any particular time. So I never met or saw Matisse in person, but I did visit, and I try and visit frequently. I go to Nice, where he spent the last years of his life, and I have paid homage to him by visiting his grave. And there's a wonderful Matisse museum in Nice, which I highly recommend. So at this stage in the 1930s, Matisse was doing these line drawings, and at the same time, earlier Picasso had been doing line drawings as well, fairly classical. And what you can admire here, it isn't exactly anatomical, but what he's done in a very few lines is he's given you an arm, he's given you breasts, he's given you legs and a buttocks, and it's a very clever picture, because if you look at it very carefully, you'll see it as a mirror. And if you look to the left, this woman's nude body, including her private parts or whatever, are being reflected in the mirror. And of course, she's reclining, so it is somewhat of a sexy kind of picture. But then what the little touches that Matisse adds are so wonderful, because you can see she's reclining on a kind of fabric, and so he's gotten the little flowers of the fabric on this couch or bed that she's reclining on. But again, as I said, Matisse is one of my favorite artists. The fact that he was trained as a lawyer adds to it, but it's an artist who I've always admired a great deal. And if we can go to number 5, whenever we need to end, that's fine, but I'll just keep going.
Now we have another 10, 12 minutes. Yeah.
Now, so here you can see the influence of line drawing. And I was thinking about what's tree-ish about a tree, and bringing it down to its elemental aspects of treeness. And so there's no color here, but I just literally was dealing with a tree as lines and leaves and so forth, and trying to bring it down to its elemental aspects. And so I don't
this is your drawing?
This is my drawing, yeah.
Okay.
And it's just called The Tree. And again, I have a place in Connecticut where I actually look up and see the trees frequently, and I'm always very much enamored of the architecture of trees and how the branches reach into space, and the wonderful just the lines created of the tree's branches against the sky. And then if we can go to number 6.
Is that another one of yours?
This is one of mine. And again, you can see some of the influences of Matisse a bit. I started out with literally just an oval, and then I did a straight line like an L, and then that was pretty much the nose, and then the other straight line is the other brow. And then I went over this, I literally just did this, and I'm just throwing this in because I did it like a day or so ago. And again, it's the idea of simplicity. After I did the outline of the face in crayon, I decided to shade it in a bit with watercolor. So I have this reddish watercolor that then fills it in. And the whole idea again is, what's the essence of something, bringing it down to its elemental levels.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see if we can do number 7. So here's back to George O'Keeffe again, and this is called From the Lake. And at this time, George O'Keeffe was frequently going up to Lake George. This was painted in 1924, and it's oil on canvas. And I just think it has such incredible color and movement. Again, when, as I say, people only think of George O'Keeffe painting big flowers, but this is, it looks like an abstract painting, but then if you look at it carefully, you'll see there's a rock that's pretty much delineated in the upper left. And then when you think of this, I assume it's like the ripples of water in a lake. And it isn't trying to be just a lake, but it's also showing what looks sort of vegetative, and it's giving you the essence of a lake down to its very simplest aspects, and then also giving you a sense of movement and color. So that to me is what an artist is supposed to do. They're not just supposed to say, here's what exists, I'm going to replicate it. It's like, I'm going to create something out of my own mind that never existed ever before. And then we'll do another, is number 8, is a Picasso. And again, Picasso probably did this in less than 5 minutes. And it's done with crayon, and it's a man with a cigarette, and you can see, you know, the eyes and the nose and the mouth don't make any sense. Like both eyes are sort of on the side, and then the nose is a profile, and which Picasso was known for, of showing different angles of the same thing simultaneously. But again, I love it as just a very simple thing, but it's very creative because, you know, he is showing you, and there's colors here that don't necessarily make any sense. Like, why is that blue coming out on the right side? Why is that streak of blue there? And why is there, you know, his near his chin, why is it green? And then there's a little splotch of yellow on the cheek, and then there's a purple blob there too, which is, I guess, sort of a cheek. So it's a very simple picture, but, you know, to me, it has a good deal of life and energy. So here I'm and again, this could easily, someone could say, well, this looks like a 12-year-old kid did it. And that's not too far from the truth. It's Jean-Michel Basquiat. Basquiat was of Haitian and heritage. He was at one point a homeless individual living in the streets of New York. He left school, he ran away from school, and was basically a street kid who was drawing on the sides of buildings, and he was writing graffiti and then drawing things all over Manhattan. And anybody who was lucky enough to have peeled off one of those drawings could make tens of thousands of dollars now. And he had a tragic end. He was knocking out art. He was actually in the basement of a gallery. A gallery owner decided pretty much to put him in the basement and just have him keep painting nonstop. And the work was being grabbed up as fast as he could create it. And now Basquiat's paintings go for upwards of $100 million. He died tragically. I think he was around 27 years of age. I got a glimpse of him because in the 80s, when he was doing most of his work, there was a whole scene in New York of people going to clubs, nightclubs, and there were a number of clubs around town. There was one called Palladium, and that's where Andy Warhol and Basquiat would hang out at what was called a VIP room. So in this picture, Basquiat often used words on a page and drew cartoons. He originally thought he might be a cartoonist. here he's doing a superhero called Flash, and you can see the superhero is wearing his sort of purple briefs and wearing a red outfit with a flash across his chest. And often Basquiat dealt with symbols of African Americans or cartoon symbols. And as I said, he once he painted a skull. He often liked to deal with anatomy because he'd also been bedridden at one point, and his mother gave him a copy of Gray's Anatomy. So he often would do skeletons and skulls. But again, you can see here action and color and a very imaginative person who's not trying to show you anything that exists in real life. He's creating this superhero and who is both in movement off to the left and then is standing there, and it's almost cartoonish. The face has these little two buck teeth in the front, and it's meant to be fun too. There's a great sense of fun. Sadly, as I said, Basquiat became addicted to heroin and died of an overdose as a young man.
I love that one.
So this is an artist named Richard Prince. I haven't really met him. I've stood about 3 feet from him. I was at the show that this began, this picture was shown. And Richard Prince had very little formal art training, just as Basquiat had very little formal art training. And what he's trying to do in many ways is kind of give you these faces and stuff that are very childlike and sort of like what a kid might scribble. Prince actually became famous for what was called appropriation and became a part of a movement of artists called the picture generation. And what he was originally doing was literally just rephotographing other people's photographs, like of the Marlboro Man as an ad. And but then he's now evolved and he's doing a lot of other things. He does sort of silly jokes where he'll do a whole painting and it'll have a kind of like a joke from a Playboy magazine, very sexist sort of joke, which is meant to be sort of an appropriation of a cartoon, but then put in a different context of being fine art. And as I said, in this, he's really going back to that whole idea of the very primitive kinds of faces, and which I sometimes like to do as well. I like to draw from my inner child and say, well, okay, how would I have drawn this as a 10-year-old? And so it's very colorful. He actually, it's also a collage. So it's actually these faces and things are some of them are glued onto each other. They're done in canvas. They're cases they're photocopied and glued together. So that's Richard Prince. And this is one of mine. It's called Thin Red Line. So again, what we've seen in the 20th century is that art doesn't have to be representing anything. It can just be color. It can just be form. And so what I've done here is I've laid down layers and layers of acrylic paint, and you can look through into the surface of the picture. This is actually done on paper again. But then I've wanted to break up this chaotic background, which has several colors. If you look, you'll see blue and red and orange and so on. So it's not monochromatic. Yeah, and then you'll see I've actually scratched onto the surface of the paper. So we have this kinetic aspect of it. And then as a contrast to that, I've gone with a red marker and I've just gone a diagonal right through this very chaotic background. So as I said, this is all my pictures are not meant to be figurative. Some are just meant to be abstract. And what it's meant is to be very soothing. It's a picture you can look into and just be very hypnotic. And it doesn't have to be anything. It's simply color and form on paper. Yeah. And so this is, I was thinking of Walt Whitman. I just did this also this year. And you can see that this character includes various races and various aspects of his personality. And so you've got African American, and you've got pink skin, and you've got orange skin, and different expressions. And the various aspects of this person have even gone into the lapel. So you'll see there's a face on the lapel. This actually draws back to what I was doing 55 years ago. Remember, with that head, with all the various faces. So I did this in watercolor, and then I've done crayon and so on. And again, it's meant to show how we all are, as I make a living as a lawyer, but I also I've spent as much time doing artwork as I have doing law. So am I an artist? Am I a lawyer? Am I whatever? So I'm also a husband. I'm, the son of my parents. And with you as a professor who is my former sociology professor, I take on one role. If I were with a peer, I might take on another role. If I were talking to someone like Adam, I might be a slightly other role. So this is how we all are various people, all within one basic.
I like that idea. It wouldn't have occurred to me that that's what it represents, but yeah, I can see that now. Great. I want to ask about whether when you are traveling, do you take your art supplies with you, and how do you manage traveling with art gear?
What I often, if you'll see, like a lot of work that I did when we were on the road, I had a pad, and the pad is like a 9x12, and then I have some markers. And so a lot of the work that I did on the road, they're less of using watercolors or acrylic, but they're more line drawings. And so yeah, even when I was in France, also I just had a simple, which I took with me, like some magic markers and a pad. I actually had a smaller pad at that point. It was really just I'd say probably 6x9, and so no matter where I am, even if I only doodle in the margin of a notebook or something, I love to be creative. I love to have something in my hand, and as I say, I think that creates a mental state that's very relaxing to me.
Well, we used up our time, and I can't think of anything more fun than what we've just been doing. So it's been a highly enjoyable get together.
I've enjoyed it, and which I didn't get into, but just as a little plug I admire what your work is, and the fact that you're working towards global peace and people understanding one another. And again, so a plug for art is that we know that art is universal, and even in the most primitive parts of the world, Aboriginal people in Australia, wherever, do art, and sometimes very complicated, very, very complex art. And so I hope that some of the images I create, and I think the images that other people create, have a way of communicating. And when I'm in, and I've been to many countries, about 40 or 50 around the world, I love going to museums, and I see artists, that have international appeal, so that I'll see Andy Warhol in Japan just as much as I'll see him in New York. And the collectors in Hong Kong, so, a lot of Western art is extremely popular in Hong Kong.
Okay. We got to sign off now. So thank you so much, John. It's been fun.
We'll come up to Toronto, and maybe Rebecca's working on a new book, so we'll have to get a plug up there in University of Toronto.
Absolutely. Terrific. Okay, and give her a hug for me. And thank you very much, John. Take care. Okay, bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Project Saves the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, and sometimes more. This is episode 393. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website to savetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get to the website, please look around, because we have conversations going on all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. And after you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. And if you have an event that you want to post for your organization or activist project, you can do so on the events listing. This whole website is a place for dialogue. So please join in. See you there.